Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
So my name is Goran. I work at UCSD. I teach there in research, and I never expected actually that I was going to end up in a corn lab. So I recently joined the lab that uses corn as a model organism, and we're looking at some gene activity in the corn relative to host pathogen resistance. But that's not what this is about. I actually last night I was trying to figure out what to talk about, and my wife, dear wife who's sitting here, said, come up with something really scientific and cool, or take like a little kind of a detail and talk about it. And I didn't think that would be fair to corn or the topic too. So I'm going to kind of zoom out of this whole issue and try to present this in a way that you can consider different priorities, and which would eventually force the dialogue here a little bit. So when you talk about corn, you can look at the corn from an individual human perspective, right? Every person consumes corn one way or the other, and what does this really do for us? But then the priorities change a little bit when you start looking at it from a population perspective. Population biology often has a different priorities than an individual within a population, so that's pretty interesting. And then we have to bring the issue about using corn as an energy source and a biofuel, because without that you can't really get a good idea of what's going on. And then how good is the corn actually for the economy, short run versus a long-term effect. And then what are we really doing to our ecosystem? Is this really a good thing for us? Is it reversible? Can we afford to actually give corn this much of a stage? And then you zoom out from there and you look at a little bit of an impact on the environment, on the planet. And so I can spend a lot of time here talking about how fantastic corn is as a model organism for genetics. We can ask many cool questions in the genetics and play with it. The whole genome is sequenced, and we can turn the genes off and on and see really what they do and try to improve certain traits. But what I want to end this with is talking about the entire issue from a corn's point of view. And you pretending that you're a corn, how would you actually see this whole situation? What do you really think about this, right? So you have to look at within the last 100 years, you can't really approach the issue unless you look at the relationship between a human and corn coevolution, if you would. If you look at the last 100 years, or area of the 100 years, and look at the predicted models, by the 2050 we're supposed to reach about 10 to 11 billion people on the planet. That's not that big of a deal, because most scientists agree that in about 1970s we started slowly plateauing, and if you look at the fertility rates, we're really not too concerned about overpopulating the planet. So by the 2050 we should actually start plateauing, having a relatively flat line, and eventually decreasing. But if you look at the corn from 1960s all the way to now, you can see a very steady increase where the corn actually surpasses both rice and wheat as a major crop in the world. This is a world grain production from 1960 to 2013. So trends are very similar, and there's a positive correlative effect between an increase in human population and increase in the corn production. Because this movie was made 10 years ago, so this kind of gives you an idea, the trend is actually staying very predictable. And if you look at the hotspots in the corn production in the world, obviously you have significant outliers. Corn is produced everywhere, but the United States is by far the biggest producer of corn in the world. China is another big one. Europe produces a lot of corn. There's a lot of corn in Argentina and Brazil and South America too. But by far, the United States, when it comes to the land use and the corn production, is most efficient corn producer. But what's interesting about that trend, though, is if you look at the 2016, 2017, and the area from about 2004 and 5, eventually 2006, you have this really big increase in alcohol corn use. And that has to do with the Bush administration actually pushing the subsidy plans where you are encouraging farmers to produce a lot of corn to be utilized for the ethanol, for the biofuel. So if you look at the food use for the corn, it's staying relatively stable from 1980s all the way to now. And then if you look at the feed and residual use, that's relatively stable. It's kind of moving around. But then you have this really huge spike in the ethanol production off of corn, which actually drives a lot of corn production. And then if you look at the US corn acreage in the field, we actually committed a lot of acreage in 1920s and 30s to the corn. But then there is this spike right here in the use of area to grow the corn recently. That has to do with the 2006 subsidies plan to grow the corn for ethanol. Now, what this picture doesn't really, this graph doesn't really show is that we've gotten exponentially better at getting a lot of corn from the land that we're growing it on. I'm going to get into that in a second, and why is that really so important. So you would expect actually a more land use to be committed to corn, and then you have a spike, but then you have to remember that really the corn production, the yield, significantly increased, although this is not really reflected in how much land is committed to the corn use in the United States. And then both when it comes to the exports of corn and the imports of corn, all the trends are actually pointing up. So the corn is here to stay, and it's not about to slow down anytime soon, right? Now, I want to give the corn its due, because corn is actually cool. When you really think about it, we are not cool. We're the one who actually overpackage things, oversell it, misuse it for the other things. So corn takes a lot of beating as a plant, unjustly so, because I think we don't give it a kind of a stage that it deserves. Corn is a great source of nutrients. It's rich in B vitamins, it has a lot of magnesium, it has a lot of potassium. It actually provides a lot of protein in a building block, and what people don't realize, most of the people don't realize, it's actually very low in sugar content relative to other grains and some fruits too. Banana has twice as much sugar than the corn if you really just consume the corn directly, right? And then, so what do? We actually became fantastically good and resourceful as using everything that we can out of the corn. So cornmeal and cornstarch and corn oil are ubiquitous. Everybody's using it. But then we have to have a little fun with the corn, so we eventually use it as a grain alcohol and produce a really good quality bourbon. You can buy a beer that is actually manufactured straight off of the corn. And then the movie addressed this a lot, and I don't want to get into this because I want to show you a little bit of a historical perspective. High fructose corn syrup. A lot of studies show a very clear correlation between the type 2 diabetes epidemics around the world and the use of high fructose corn syrup. So notice how, so I have to do this. Notice how I try to put as far as I can the corn syrup and alcohol from the adolescent girl eating the corn as I can to be politically correct. But here's the problem. This is where we run into the issues. If you look at the corn production, most of the corn that is being produced is not produced for the human consumption. And so what people don't also realize is that if you go to your grocery store and buy the corn to use for a popcorn or just use the sweet corn to put on a salad, that is not a genetically modified corn. That is actually outbred corn that is good for you. So if you look at all the corn brands that you can buy off the shelf for the direct use, that is not a genetically modified organism. A lot of people don't realize that. But almost all the corn used for the production of ethanol or for the animal feed is genetically modified, and it's separately grown. Yes?
Is there a distinction between corn production in the United States and corn production in other countries in terms of that ratio of corn for processing versus corn for
right. Most of the countries, yes, that's a really good question, because some smaller countries actually commit more corn for the nutrients, feeding the population, because it's a part of the culture and everything else. For example, so here's an interesting thing. The lady that I work with who runs the corn lab is not even allowed to take a corn seed into New Zealand, where her husband is from, because the New Zealand has such a tight regulations about any kind of genetically modified organisms that you can't grow any GMO corn, even for their feed. So different countries have different regulations about it, and a lot of them commit more of a wild corn for the food and less for the feed. So the problem is that the majority of the corn is either used to feed animals that actually evolutionarily are not supposed to eat corn at all. They are supposed to eat grass. So we force feed animals corn and create a lot of problems when it comes to their health and eventually our health. And then there's a huge spike in corn production because of the ethanol being part of the biofuel. But what you're going to realize is that the corn is hugely fossil fuel hungry and expensive when it comes to production of biofuels. So because we have to put that in the whole content. And then we actually use the corn to make plastics. So if you go to the grocery store and buy a magazine, that sheen on the plastic sheen on a magazine that you get that looks like a really nice quality paper is actually corn, right? So 1/40 of the corn produced in the United States is actually used for the human use. Rest of it is used for animal feed and the biofuels. Okay, so Vandana Shiva, who is a big activist and an Indian farmer, has this quote. He says, "We are still eating World War II leftovers." And I want to explain what that means and how is this related to corn, because to me it's really interesting. So Michael Pollan in the movie, who is a big proponent of healthy food and so forth, was talking about the 1970s and really big spike in subsidies. But to really understand the process, you have to go to the Haber, the Franz Haber, who is a German scientist who actually probably came up with the most important discovery for humans in the earlier 20th century. And he actually came up with a process of how to liberate the bound nitrogen that is in the atmosphere and actually liberate it and put it in the soil. So nitrogen, atmosphere is 80% nitrogen. That nitrogen is bound tightly to each other and it's inert. It doesn't want to react to anything. It has a triple covalent bond. This is why you don't breathe nitrogen. You settle for oxygen. So that nitrogen is stuck and we don't use it. So the way that we actually get a nitrogen in the food chain is from bacteria in a soil living around the roots, fixing the nitrogen and combining it with the hydrogen. And that's a very renewable process, but the process is slow, relatively slow. But we survived for a long time actually counting on that. So in this process, you actually use a lot of fossil fuel energy to liberate the nitrogen, break nitrogen apart, and eventually combine it with hydrogen. And that was actually really important because one of these processes was used to make ammunition during the Second World War. So this is a very energy expensive process, but in 1930s, we started introducing F1 hybrid corn species that was fantastic at actually pulling the nitrogen out of the soil and eventually assimilating it into itself and growing very fast. That allowed us to predict the yields and eventually anticipate a very steady growth in a corn production. And so here's what happened. To really understand this relationship, you have to go back to 1947. This is an ammunition plant in Alabama who, after the end of the World War II, was stuck with a huge piles of nitrogen that was used to make ammunition. And the issue is, what are we going to do with it? Well, we actually used this chemical process of creating ammonium nitrate as a fertilizer. So there was no reason to actually manufacture more ammunition. So we used that nitrogen that was actually a stockpile, forced it to combine with the hydrogen, creating the fertilizer, which was a preferred food for the type of corn that we can actually grow to give us predictable yields. So what that actually led to is huge farming boom. We started, and this was, I just want to make something clear, this was an absolute necessity because this happened in the United States after the Second World War. Europe actually did the same thing in the 50s and 60s, and this was all introduced to China in the late 60s, early 70s, which technically allowed us to feed an ever-growing population and meet the kind of emerging world hunger at the time. So that eventually gave us these huge predictable yields and ability to control the crops. So, so how expensive is really, or expansive really, the corn is? If we agree that this process, and we can look at all this stuff up on your own, is very, very energetically fossil fuel expensive process just to create the fertilizer. I'm not even talking about managing the fertilizer, taking it to the field, pumping it into the soil, harvesting, moving the corn back and so forth, which all requires the fossil fuel. If we just start with that, and you go to your average supermarket nowadays that has about 45,000 items, over a quarter of those eventually has corn in it. It's just a clever manipulation of molecules to think that you have choices, but it's really not. What it is just kind of a shuffling molecule from one entity to the other and pretending that it's actually something else. Now, this is a kind of a busy figure, and I don't want to stay at it too much, but the correlation between how much corn we use, not directly for consumption, but through the food additives actually correlates with the predictable increase in epidemic worldwide in diabetes 2, mostly human health problems. And then if you consider the animal feed, that most of the corn that we produce is for the animal feed and the biofuels, like we said before, and direct impact on our landscape, that eventually results in a change of the landscape within the United States and a possible loss of biodiversity, we end up with a huge environmental problems. We've managed it in a process, and this is just not corn's fault, obviously. We're talking about raising animals in massive numbers for food and feeding them, mostly grains. We managed to create a 12,000-mile completely oxygen-deprived dead zone off of the Gulf of Mexico, because all this fertilizer that is being produced to artificially, synthetically feed our crops ends up washing up in the ocean. And so at the Delta Mississippi, there is a huge area that is absolutely completely devoid of any marine life. It doesn't exist anymore. So the reason for that is because we pump more fertilizer than plants can ever take, and that washes off. And right now, actually, we have a project at the UCSD looking at the effects of golf courses on local plants. They've been here for a very, very long time, being outcompeted by invasive plants who can simply take nitrogen faster out of the soil and deplete most of the carbon as a source and technically decimate the local plant population. So the rate, when it comes to the corn expense, is about 10 to 1. What that means is it takes about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie of food right now. And so if you translate it a little further, it takes about 10 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of beef, edible beef, that is corn-fed. So if you actually take these numbers a little differently, and this is how much we use of the ethanol for the gasoline consumption. You're literally people in areas of the world that are actually having a famine are competing for the SUVs for ethanol. So really, 507 million people per day can be fed relative to how much ethanol we produce daily to run our cars, which is a staggering number, actually. So do we really have a problem, and what is the remedy? So corn is expensive because it's technically a fossil fuel hungry grain. It's not really hard to grow corn, but the way we misuse it becomes very, very expensive. And we had, obviously, the movie tried to convince you that we have emerging epidemic relative to diabetes, and then we can consider all the bigger environmental issues besides just local ones. But really, the issue comes down to a choice. It's usually need versus want. We are a little too greedy, a little too insecure. We want too much. We use more than we really need. And how do we ruin everything? We package it and misuse it. We use it for things that we really shouldn't. So if you really think about need versus want, maybe the solutions are really, really simple. Maybe you should just move cows off of the feedlot and let them graze like they're supposed to. And in a process, consume a little less meat every once in a while, which will take a pressure off of all this fossil fuel production and then invest more heavily into the alternative energy sources. I mean, the choices are really, if you want to stop the economy in this country, all you have to do is stop buying stuff, literally. And if you really think about how our healthcare system works, it's based on people being sick. Healthcare system is really good if you're sick. And how do I legally keep you sick? Through food. That's the easiest way to keep you sick, because if my customer keep coming for more medication, more people get paid, and better the economy runs. So actually it really starts with the personal choices, because if there is no demand or the demand is less, well, the supplies has to go down or they're going to run out of business. But give corn its due. Use it as a fantastic crop for the human health. Keep it in a daily diet, but combine it with the other things and make sure that you actually do right by environment. And kind of reestablish the relationship with the corn that we're used to, that we know, and really take advantage of it on a personal level instead of this huge mass production where we have a lot of casualties in the entire process. But then I want to actually flip this story just for the last slide, and I want you to see this from a corn's point of view. And this is, I think, a really important way, because we are a very subjective species, and all decisions that we make come from our perspective. So pretend being a corn for a second. And you've seen this before in elementary school, right? You've seen a food chain, and what the food chain incorrectly shows here is that there is a grass or a plant that is a primary producer because they utilize the sun and the water to photosynthesize, and they actually build sugars. That's what they are. These are sugars. Technically, that is food for you, hence the subjectivity, right? And then you go through honoring other species in the ecosystem. So you say, oh, there's a primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and then final consumer, and eventually decomposer. And you ask people, what's on the top of the food chain? And they always arrogantly say humans. And I usually start laughing hysterically, because you can't be possibly more wrong. We're just a bag for genes. You're a lot more of a bacteria or a virus than you are a human, technically. Not technically, but physically. So let's do this for a second. Let's throw, oops, it's not going there. You got to give me my corn there. It's not moving? It's stuck? It can't be stuck now. This is the most important part. I am the corn. No. See, this guy right here, he's supposed to fly and go right in here. And you're not going to imagine it. We're going to show it to you. Corn is not a producer. Corn is consumer. Corn, like any other species on the planet, has the same agenda. Utilize the energy sources and the calories available to you in the environment and build yourself as much as you can and spread yourself around as much as you can. That's what species do. That's a basic biology. So that's what the corn does. Utilizes sun and water and eventually produces itself. That's the agenda. So if you think about this, corn has romanticized us and convinced us that it's absolutely necessary for our existence. Great. We depend on the corn hugely. This is a really important stuff. We depend on corn so much that we actually try to apply it to everything, including feeding animals that don't want to have anything to do with the corn, and it makes them sick, and produce biofuels that are technically really expensive to produce energetically. Fine, and then we are changing the landscape to accommodate the corn because we need it so badly, and then we endlessly feed it. We're shoving the fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, into the soil, making sure that this guy is really taken care of. Great. And then corn has enemies, just like everybody else. But here we come fanatically defending the corn by eliminating all the pests, which is fantastic. So the question really is, if you consider the species priorities, basic biological Darwinian selection, who actually owns who? Does corn own us? And did the corn domesticated humans so we can spread its gene throughout the environment as hard as we can? Or do we actually control corn? And I'm just going to leave you with that, and you can just think about it. Because the assumption is the corn doesn't have an intelligence, and I would really like to beg to differ here. So, okay, well, thank you for your time. And then any questions or anything that I can learn from you would be also fantastic, actually. So, yeah, I was just.
Alternative fuels pose a threat to corn in terms of their replacement for biofuel?
You know, if you really think about So we all get old, right? And the older we get, the less we want to change our habits, right? So the way we're running the country and the stuff that we have implemented as laws, older people are hard to change a little bit. So it's a huge threat, and it's a good threat. It's a fantastic threat, because you actually, to optimize the process, you have to invest energy and go backwards and change the system. And there's always natural resistance to changing the system. So yes, ethanol, people argue that ethanol is one of the more, at the time, a rightful one, but it's been so long that it's one of the more irresponsible decisions that is staying, and that we should be a lot more aggressive of actually exploring or pushing alternative fuels and removing ethanol from it. But there are political ways to do it too. I mean, you can just change the tariff program. You can allow Brazil to actually import here more and so forth. But yes, alternative fuels are one of the answers for it. However, alternative fuels, until you optimize them, are also pretty expensive to produce too. So you have to kind of go through this uncomfortable phase of learning, paying the price, revamping the system, and then eventually enjoy benefits. And usually people who run the show don't like to change that quickly.
Corn is so intrinsic to so many industries' profits.
Right,
It's
right,
hard to fight against it. I mean, I just don't eat it, but I pay a hefty price not to eat corn.
right, right. And long-term versus short-term. Are we thinking, how are we going to get through this Tuesday, or are we thinking what's really good for our grandkids? Right, that's always been an issue with humans, right, and daily choices. So I agree with you. It's a little bumpy ride to get any kind of a change, big change, and you're always going to find resistance to it, because a lot of people get paid in the process, right? So. Anything else? We're going to go and have our popcorn after this and tortillas. Yeah, I can't see, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
Do you eat corn in your everyday life?
I ate corn chips before I came here. Yeah. Yeah, but as I said before, eating a corn as a grain, I have no problem eating it, because I think highly of corn. I really do, on the individual basis. But if my daughter, who is fully independent, and I think super highly of her, if I see her using anything that has a high fructose corn syrup, I'm going to, how long are you going to be grounded for? Like 2 weeks, 3 weeks? No. But yes, we're trying really hard to, and it's such an uphill battle. We're trying so hard not to get kids, right, because they're the ones who have a power. You know, people get excited about voting and everything. Actually, the only time you vote is the time you pay. Every time you reach in your wallet, you vote. And if we had this mentality and we really kind of demanded taking care of our health in a more of a, I wouldn't say organic way, but more responsible way, and just not let people decide for us what's really good and what's not, then that would be fantastic. So corn chips, fine. Soda, never. What's that?
No, like corn syrup.
Yeah, that just, not to be rude, I find it intellectually insulting. I find that they're trying to trick me, and I'm not going to be their puppet using their product so they can get me sicker and lower my quality of life while I'm actually paying for the product that is diminishing my life quality. So that's, yeah, so that's, yeah. Yeah. So.
You mentioned that the corn that is used for consumption is non-GMO.
Right.
How are we certain that that is the case? Like, with soy, for many years everybody says, oh yeah, it's not GMO, but the big percentage, like 99%.
Right, so they're the independent science agencies that actually test it, and they just randomly walk into your grocery stores and they pull them and they do the genetic testing, and they know the genes that are being actually put into the system to increase the drought resistance, or respond better to the pesticides that are putting in and so forth. And if they can, so they sequence the genes, and if they can't find them, they deem it as a corn that hasn't been genetically modified. And so the last thing that I read, actually just last night, was that less than 5% of the corn that was tested randomly in about 1,200 supermarkets around the United States had genetically modified, evidence of some kind of a genetic modification. The rest of them didn't, which is a very encouraging number, actually. Yeah.
For like corn tortillas,
Right.
do you think they don't use the GMO corn?
You know, it would be great to test it. I don't know because I don't do studies in corn tortillas. I can't tell. But there are people who do these studies are obligated to put the data out for you to actually see. So reading, for example, a report is fantastic, but there's usually supplementary material that you can actually see. And if people can't interpret it, you can find a local scientist say, these people are claiming that there is no GMOs here. How can you explain to me how this really works? The data that I saw is pretty convincing, but again, this is just one study that is a randomized study somewhere. So I don't have the data to answer that question, unfortunately.
I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sure.